Working now? Okay, I'll repeat what I said. Welcome to this session. And we have 4 papers, and I'm going to be an authoritarian chairman to keep people to time so that everyone gets an equal opportunity to give their paper. And the first paper is by Sytske Besemer, now working for Uber in the USA, and it's on a systematic review and meta-analysis of the intergenerational transmission of criminal behavior.
Am I on? Yeah. Okay, good. Well, thanks for being here, guys. I'm very excited to be talking about this because I've been working on this for several years now. That's what you do when you do a systematic review or meta-analysis. So only do it when you really love the topic. That's what I want to say. So what is intergenerational transmission? Well, I guess if you're in this room, you probably know all of this, but I'm still going to go over some explanations for this behavior. And I want to start with showing this picture. You've probably seen this before as well, but I just love it because it really shows the idea of intergenerational transmission. And also because my family is a huge fan of Feyenoord, and you might not know it, but Feyenoord won the national championship in the Netherlands, so this is why I think it's a good time to show this picture. But why I want to show it really is, I want you to start thinking about why is this boy showing this behavior? Is that because he has bad genes? Or are his parents showing this behavior? Or is everyone around him showing this behavior? Or is he just growing up in a really bad environment where everyone does this all the time? That's what I want you to start thinking about, because that's kind of a summary of what we think about why intergenerational transmission happens. So, summarized is, there's not just one explanation. I loved this morning, someone asked David a question and said, so what are explanations for intergenerational transmission? And he started saying, you know, it's complex. There's not just one explanation. It's a combination of things. And then that person asked, well, what's your favorite explanation? So I think there is no one explanation, but there are some explanations that work together. And they create a cumulative disadvantage for kids who grow up with criminal parents. The first one, which is what most people think about naturally, is kids imitate their parents' behavior. So there's some kind of social learning, and Tremblay also referenced this in his talk. And then there's the idea that these kids grow up in an environment that's full of risk factors. So because their parents are involved in criminal behavior, these kids grow up in a different environment from kids whose parents are not involved in criminal behavior. So it's not necessarily the actual parents' behavior, but the parents' behavior causing these kids to grow up in this environment. Then the third explanation, which I think is really interesting, is that there's some kind of official bias. So there's bias by the criminal justice system towards these children. So they focus more attention on kids of criminal parents, and that's why these kids are more likely to end up in the statistics. And then the fourth explanation for intergenerational transmission is some kind of genetic or biological transmission. Well, in this talk, I'm not going to study these mechanisms, but I just want to lay the groundwork so you understand why we think intergenerational transmission happens. And why would you do a systematic review and meta-analysis? Well, because there are so many different studies. They all show different results. And if you collect all the available evidence and then put it in a meta-analysis, you can at least say, well, on average, this is what we see. So, and the question in this meta-analysis is, so if we have kids whose parents show criminal behavior and kids whose parents don't show criminal behavior, like to what extent is the parental criminal behavior associated with the kid's criminal behavior? And this is what I'm going to be talking about today. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the systematic review process. Then I'll tell you the results of the meta-analysis. And when people think about intergenerational transmission, they also think about, well, are there things that influence this relationship? For example, maybe gender. Is the transmission stronger for males or females? Or geographical location or time period. Is it stronger in one country versus the other? Is it stronger now versus 50 years ago? So we looked at that, and I'm going to tell you the results of what we found. And I'll end up with a conclusion and tell you what's missing and what we need to do to answer some of the questions that we can't answer today. So the systematic review process is basically searching very well using a systematic method, so anyone can replicate this. So you're welcome to do that. It takes a lot of time, so I don't necessarily recommend doing it. But if someone wants to maybe do this again in a couple of years and include more recent papers, then you can just take my the review process that we did, and you'll find exactly the same, hopefully. So what we did is we searched for specific keywords in lots of search engines. We read through the bibliographies of books and their citations. We hand-searched key journals, so we went through the table of contents, and we contacted experts in the field and directors of major longitudinal studies. So maybe you got an email from me in the past few years, several times, asking you whether there were any studies. And then studies were only included based on specific criteria. And in the interest of time, we had 7, but in the interest of time, I'm only going to discuss the most relevant ones, because some of these criteria didn't distinguish whether studies were included or not, because they all papers had the same response to that criteria. But the first one was that we needed a control group. So we needed a group of kids with criminal parents, but we also needed a group of kids without criminal parents. And when I'm talking about criminal, we included official records, we included self-reports, we included parental and children's reports of their parents' behavior. So, but it had to be criminal according to the law. And I'm mentioning this because there are a lot of studies who look at offspring behavior earlier in life, and that's not necessarily criminal. It might be aggressive behavior, or it might be conduct problems, but in this we didn't want to compare apples and oranges, so we only included criminal behavior, but it could be self-reported. And the most important criteria was that we had to have enough numerical information to either there should be an effect size, or we had to be able to calculate an effect size. And we contacted many people, and lots of them were super helpful and sent us more information. But some, they couldn't, or they didn't. It was so long ago, they didn't have the information, so then we couldn't include the paper. We did include your paper, Darrick. I got the data. No worries. So if you want to see all of the criteria, see the paper. So we identified about 23,000 references using these methods. And then after examining the titles and the abstracts of all the references and discarding the obviously irrelevant ones, we were left with about 1,400 reports. And we could only retrieve 1,324 reports. And in the end, we had 67 reports, but there were several studies that appeared more than once in different papers. So we ended up with 23 samples for which we could code effect sizes, and they came from 21 studies in 25 reports. And that's what the meta-analysis results are based on. So interesting, we could only locate studies in Western countries. So you see, the world is pretty big, and we only have a tiny percentage. So we have many different countries, but not enough from nothing from Africa, South America, Asia. So that's pretty shocking, I think. And the UK has the highest number of papers on intergenerational transmission, and I guess most of you can guess why. Because there is a study which is called the Cambridge Study in Delinquent Development, and there are many papers on the Cambridge Study in Delinquent Development. And we see a clear increase in papers since the 1990s. And it says 2010 plus because our searches ended, I think, end of 2015, 2016. And there have been many more recent papers. So there's a huge increase. And you can see that as well in this symposium. There are so many sessions and talks about intergenerational transmission. It's a hot topic, clearly. So the snapshots from the systematic review show that we only could find studies from Western countries. The Cambridge study dominates, and the last few years has seen the highest numbers of papers on intergenerational transmission. But then the biggest question, how strong is intergenerational transmission? To what extent is parental crime associated with children's crime? Well, if we only include studies and we don't look at whether they control for other factors, we find an odds ratio of 2.38. And if you haven't seen a meta-analysis before, this is a forest plot. It basically, let's see whether I understand how this works. No. Well, this is a list of studies that were included. After every study, you'll see a square, that's the effect size, and you'll see a bar, which is the confidence interval. And so you'll see that, and the one below there is the average. So you'll see that most are around 2, and there are some that are much lower and some that are much higher, but they have a huge confidence interval, so it's less reliable. So we also had specific studies who controlled for other risk factors for crime, and if we took the average of those ones, we found that the odds are about 1.8 times higher, so still about twice as high. And obviously there were fewer studies because not all of them included other factors, and other factors vary per study, but you could think of socioeconomic status, cognitive abilities, unstable household, social support, household attitudes, those kind of things. And again, I can give you much more detail, but I think the message is, even if we control for other factors, we still find significant intergenerational transmission. And then the more interesting questions, I think. Is intergenerational transmission moderated by gender? Well, yes, we've actually found that it's stronger from mothers to kids. So mothers to daughters was on average an odds ratio of 3.15. And then mothers to sons is about 2.5. Fathers to daughters is also 2.5. Fathers to sons is 2.14. So we see that it's much stronger for mothers. So why would that be the case? Well, it could be maybe because mothers are still main caregivers often. As Rolf Lober mentioned yesterday, there's this idea of the gender paradox. So if the behavior is rare in the one gender, it's generally more severe. So if women are less likely to commit crime, but if they do, it might be more severe. There might be more stigma for criminal women. And another thing is the idea that, well, maybe fathers are more often absent, and then they can actually be a protective factor for these kids. And then the question, does it matter what country you're in for intergenerational transmission? So do these associations vary across countries? And I just want you to think about it for yourself. Which of these countries would have the strongest intergenerational transmission? And then, yes, the US has the strongest intergenerational transmission. That's what you thought, right? Well, we see that in the US it's about 3.1 on average, and in Sweden it's about 2, and Denmark is about 1.9. Those were the only significant differences. And with this systematic review meta-analysis, we cannot draw any causal conclusions, but we can see that it seems like we do see more intergenerational transmission in more punitive environments. But again, we don't know anything about cause and effect. It could be just coincidence, or it could be something else causing this. And what about the time period? Would it be stronger now or in the past? So we see that it's stronger in more recent generations. So if we look at cohorts born after 1981, it's about 2.9, and before it's about 2, the odds ratio. And interestingly, that also correlates with incarceration rates and also in how punitive environments are. So again, we cannot draw any causal conclusions, but I still think it's interesting to note this pattern where we see stronger intergenerational transmission in more punitive time periods and more punitive countries. So to summarize in the conclusion, so we went from about 23,000 references to about 1,300 reports to 23 samples, all from Western countries. And showing average odds ratios between 1.8 if we control for other factors to 2.4 if we don't control for other factors. And we see stronger intergenerational transmission from mothers in the US and in more recent samples. So what do we need now? So I hope you're all inspired to do more work on intergenerational transmission. And clearly, like I said, it's a hot topic. People are interested in this. So I hope that this systematic review meta-analysis can tell you what to do next, because at the moment we still can't answer a lot of questions. So I think first we need more studies from non-Western countries. It's shocking, I showed you the map, that we only have a tiny percentage of countries, and most are North America, Europe. And we need large-scale prospective studies, so we can follow people over time, so we can do within-person analyses and at least say a little bit more about cause and effect. And mostly we need these studies using experimental or quasi-experimental designs. Well, we obviously can't assign people to having a criminal parent or not, but we can still use experimental designs in terms of how we punish these people, like Martin Kilias did in Switzerland, where people were randomly assigned to incarceration or another non-custodial sentence. So I think if we don't start doing these things in 10 or 15 years' time, we still don't have these answers. So these are the 3 most important things that we should be doing. So the paper is not yet out, but hopefully soon, and then you can read all the details. And otherwise, you can also just come to me and I can tell you them.
Thanks very much to Sytske. I think we'll take questions at the end, please, because that will give the chance for all 4 papers to be presented. So please hold your questions till the end, and we'll move on to the second paper, which is by Jessica Craig of the University of North Texas, and it's called Adverse Childhood Experiences Among the Cambridge Study in Delinquent Development, Prevalence, Impact, and Protective Factors.
Okay, thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. I just appreciate you being here, and I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about my research. So I'm an assistant professor at the University of North Texas, and this is a project I've started working on with some of my colleagues at other institutions. So what we are interested in is this new perspective on childhood trauma. It's referred to as adverse childhood experiences, and it was first the foundation for it was laid out in 1998 when some researchers identified a set of these 10 negative experiences among a sample of privately insured adults in the state of California. And so you can see the list there, but it's a lot of different traumatic or otherwise negative experiences. And they found that those who experienced these ACEs were more likely to have a wide range of adverse outcomes, negative outcomes. So this ranged from physical health outcomes, such as cancer, heart disease. They're more likely to die early. It's also been found that these people are more likely to have lower educational attainment, more likely to be unemployed, and more recently, using a sample of adjudicated delinquents from the state of Florida, it has been found that these individuals are more likely to offend, they're more likely to be serious, chronic, and violent juvenile offenders, and they're also more likely to recidivate than those that do not have these ACEs. And so an important note to point out on ACEs is it's really unique how they're coded. So we don't count the number of times that an individual has experienced emotional abuse or physical abuse, etc. It's more of a count of the diversity of those experiences. So if someone experiences anywhere from 1 count of emotional abuse to 10, they receive a 1 for that measure. So the scale is going to range from 0 to 10, 0 indicating they've experienced all ACEs, while 10 indicates they've experienced all 10 of them at least once. And so that's just important to point out. So we're not talking about frequency of ACEs, we're talking about diversity. And so sometimes people will be like, oh, well, what if we were to separate those ACEs to look at distinct types of these adverse experiences? And part of the argument behind the ACE framework is the research finds that these ACEs are highly correlated. If you experience one, you're more likely to experience other types of ACEs. And further, they have strong cumulative effects on brain development. And as Professor Tremblay talked about just in his lecture, there may be effects that it has on gene expression as well. And so these are just important points to keep in mind. So another area that I'm also interested in is protective factors. And so criminology we would like to focus on risk factors and what predicts people offending. But another important point that started to recently receive more attention is what are those factors that moderate the impact of a risk factor on crime? And so I'm using the paradigm from Lober et al. And so they're looking at not just promotive factors, but in the presence of risk factors, what is it that helps protect, that helps buffer the negative impact of those risk factors? So there has been some research to start identifying these protective factors, and they've been generally categorized into those 5 domains. So some of these include low extroversion, high IQ, low parental stress, having a mother with a full-time job, exhibiting strong school commitment, having high educational achievement, having few friends, strong social support, and having perceived legitimacy of authority. So within the ACE framework specifically, and are there any protective factors that buffer that negative impact of ACEs on crime? To the best of our knowledge, there's only really been one study, and that was a study that I conducted with some of my colleagues that was published in Youth Violence and Juvenile Justice this year. And so we were interested in the impact of social bonds and if that moderates the impact of ACEs on crime. And so we found that those with higher social bonds were less likely to reoffend, but this did not moderate the relationship between ACEs and reoffending. So this was not a protective factor. But something else that I think bears mention whenever we're talking about protective factors is pulling in the literature from developmental psychology on resiliency. And resiliency likes to focus on whenever an individual has experienced trauma, has experienced these threats that we know otherwise can lead to bad outcomes, but then they don't offend. They don't have that negative health outcome. What is it about them? What is it that leads to that positive adaptation? And so there's been some work to focus on resiliency related to crime specifically. For instance, the work by Warner and Smith in 1982 and 1992, they used the 1955 Kauai longitudinal study birth cohort, and they found that based on a sample of those identified at risk, at birth, so these were factors, neonatal factors, family, poverty factors, those kinds of things. They found that these factors, such as high IQ, having good classroom behavior, those were protective of offending among this at-risk sample. And if you remember, a lot of these were similar to what criminologists have identified as protective factors. So we're seeing that regardless of how we operationalize who's at risk, we're identifying common factors that are protective for offending. So that kind of brings me to my current study. So I kind of want to combine these 2 literatures. And so, as I said, ACEs, we know that it's, at least among one sample, the sample of adjudicated delinquents from Florida, we see that it is associated with more offending. But I wanted to see, does that apply to other samples? It was just the state of Florida, so let's look at it from another perspective. And so that was my first research question. And then my second question was, can we identify any of those protective mechanisms? And so I used a much wider variety of protective factors than I did in my previous study, because I was able to use the Cambridge study in delinquent development. And so for those that are not aware, this is a sample of 411 boys from South London, and they were initially interviewed at age 8 and interviewed several times up to age 48. We also have their conviction records between the ages of 10 and 56, and then their parents, peers, and teachers were also interviewed throughout their adolescence, and so it's a great wealth of risk factors and potential protective factors as well. So for my study, I used 2 different measures of offending. For my delinquency measure, this is a dichotomous measure of if they ever offended, or if they were convicted, between the ages of 10 and 16. And then I also had a lifetime offending dichotomous measure, which represented if they were ever convicted between the ages of 10 and 56. So for my ACE measure, because the Cambridge study did predate the ACE framework, it does not have a measure of all 10 ACEs. However, I was able to compile a measure of 7 ACEs, or 6 measures of 7 ACEs. And so those specific measures are emotional and physical abuse due to the original coding of the data that had to be coded into one measure, emotional neglect, household mental illness, parental separation and divorce, household member with incarceration history. And so then in the traditional ACE framework, you measure if they ever experience that, and then you sum that up on a scale from 0 to 6, and that is their ACE score. For my protective factors, I replicated the study based on one that David Farrington did with his colleagues in 2016. And they looked at a wide range of potential protective factors, and they trichotomized these variables. So they identified, it's typically in the quartiles, top 25%, middle 50%, and lower 25%. And to save our eyes, I did not include the list, but I can go over those with you afterwards if you would like to know exactly what were all of the factors that we looked at. So for my analyses, I first looked at both the prevalence of ACEs among the Cambridge study, as well as the impact that that had on mean delinquency rates and mean offending rates. Then for my main focus on the protective factors, I conducted several logistic analyses. So first, I looked at the delinquency outcome. And so to look at that, I had 2 different measures of risk. So I looked at the effect of those protective factors on likelihood of delinquency if someone had experienced at least 1 ACE versus no ACEs. And then I also had a higher risk sample based on a cut point of 3 or more ACEs. And so I did that for both the delinquency outcome and then the lifetime offending outcome, again, using those 2 measures of risk. So for my results, so first we can see the frequency. So as you can see, ACEs were not necessarily uncommon. About 75% of the sample has experienced at least 1 ACE. So you can see the modal outcome is, they've experienced 1 ACE for the mode. And then you can see the prevalence tends to go down over time. And so for the 6 ACE, that's so low because only 1 person in the sample had experienced all 6 ACEs in the Cambridge data. And then this represents the relationship between ACEs and mean delinquency. So we can see that just generally, as you experience more ACEs, you are more likely to be delinquent between the ages of 10 and 16. And again, I just want to remind you that the 6 appears low, but it's only based on 1 case. So in my future iteration of this project, I'm going to combine 5 and 6, just so that, we don't have that issue with that low sample size. And the ANOVA for this did show that this is significant, that the relationship between ACEs and delinquency is significant. And then here's the results of the trend between ACEs and mean offending. So this is through age 10 to 56. And again, you can see that generally more ACEs means you're more likely to offend, and this increases with ACE prevalence. Again, the ANOVA was significant for this analysis. So for my logistic analyses, as I was looking at 24 risk factors across 4 different sets, so those at normal risk, right, 1 ACE versus those with no ACEs, and then those with at least 3 ACEs relative to those with 2 or fewer ACEs, it got to be a lot of tables, so I'm just kind of consolidating the results to save all of our eyes right now. So this shows what protective factors were significant across all 4 analyses. So you can see the low daring being rated low in hyperactivity, low troublesomeness, small family size, and having good child rearing were all found to be protective across those 4 different analyses. I also want to point out that, so while I only had those 5 out of 24 that was significant across all 4, we had several that were significant at either 3 or 2 of the different analyses. So to save time, I'm only showing 1 table, but I have access to the other 3 if you would like to see them. So this presents the results of the logistic analyses among those with at least 1 ACE compared to those with no ACEs. Let's see. Okay, so this shows the column for anyone with at least 1 ACE, And the second set shows the results among those with no ACEs. So the first column is going to indicate the prevalence of delinquents among those with that protective factor. And then this second column is for those that do not have that protective factor. So just as an example of how to read this, for those with high verbal IQ that had one ACE, only 16% of them offended, and this is relative to 30% of those with one ACE that were not protected, that did offend. And I'm only presenting the results that were significant, again, just to kind of save our eyes. So the couple of findings I really wanted to point out is the effects of low daring and low troublesomeness. Those had both an odds ratio of 5 or 7.28 respectively, indicating these had substantive effects on delinquency. Another point is you can see that regardless of what factor it was, in general, if you were protected and you had an ACE, your offending was much lower than those that were not protected with that factor. And so we can see that even with this level of risk, you are protected from offending with the presence of these protective factors. So in conclusion, because I know I'm kind of pressed for time a little bit, one of the things we wanted to do was expand our understanding of the impact of ACEs on crime using a different sample. And so with the Cambridge study, we were able to see that, yeah, even we saw that before this applied to a group of delinquents from Florida, and now we see that it also applies to a group of boys from South London. We see that 75% of them had experienced at least one ACE, and this is actually a little bit higher than what it was in the original study. That original study of the adults, it was about 65%. Also, we see that as you experience more ACEs, you are more likely to be delinquent, and you're also more likely to offend across the life course. And we also saw that protective factors did emerge. We had several protective factors that were significant in buffering that relationship between ACEs and crime. I thought it was interesting to note the similarities. As I said, the Farrington et al. Study used those same 24 risk or protective factors that we used, and we were able to have several of those protective factors in common. For instance, the Farrington et al. Study identified low troublesomeness as being protective against having high hyperactivity and having a large family size. We also found that having low daring was also protective, and the Farrington et al. Study also found that being low daring protected against high maternal nervousness and poor child rearing. And if we go back to the literature on resiliency, it argues that whenever you have these risk factors, I'm sorry, getting mixed up in my notes, okay. We know that if we see that these characteristics are protective against several different types of risk, if that's ACEs or other risk factors, there may be something going on there. And so if we turn to the literature on resiliency, it would argue that maybe we should try to see if these protective factors would help buffer the impact of of other risk factors on other types of outcomes besides just crime. So like all studies, this one is not without its limitations. As I said before, my ACE measure does not include all 10 ACEs. So we also have to keep in mind that the ACE framework measures these adverse experiences through age 18, and this measured either through age 10 or 15. So at best, this is a conservative estimate of the impact of ACEs on crime and those protective factors. And while the Cambridge study is based on a sample of men from London, it does have a lot of great data that we're able to use. It's very rich, and so that kind of helps balance out the limited generalizability. So for future directions, along with seeing how do these protective factors buffer against other adverse outcomes, I also think it would be worthwhile looking at how one's context may impact these moderating effects. We recognize that having these protective factors, that doesn't just operate in isolation. So for instance, how does being low and daring, how does that operate when you have a lot of delinquent peers at your school? How does that operate differently for males versus females? And so I think those would be other good future directions for us to go in. So I think that's all I have. So I'll go ahead and turn this over. Thank you.
That's fine, yeah. Okay, thank you very much to Jessica. The next presenter is Darrick Jolliffe from the University of Greenwich.
Not there yet.
He said he's changed his title, so I won't read the title that's in the conference book. We'll find out shortly what the title is.
I can't seem to make the cursor move. There. There. Slowly. 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 Got it.
Okay, good. Personality and self-reported offending.
Hi, everyone. My name's Darrick Jolliffe. I'm from the University of Greenwich. I've done this work with David Farrington and Maria Toffi from the Institute of Criminology at Cambridge University. Now, definitely, the most influential theory of personality and crime comes from Hans Eysenck. Hans Eysenck was very interested in how various aspects of the central nervous system and arousal in the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system may cause or be associated with increased likelihood of offending. And he suggested that superordinate personality factors may be proxy measures of these facets of these aspects of autonomic arousal or central nervous system arousal. He suggested that it was aspects of high extroversion, so those people who were particularly sensation-seeking or venturesomeness, those people who were highly neurotic, anxious and depressed, and those people who were high on psychoticism, those people who are aggressive and unempathic, were more likely to be offenders. Noting, of course, that high psychoticism is tautological in that if you're aggressive, by definition, you're more likely to be an offender, which is why we won't be talking anymore about psychoticism in this paper. He also suggested that female offenders would have the same personality profile as male offenders, and also, somewhat controversially, suggested that all sociological factors that we're aware of associated with offending have their impact through these personality structures. And in describing this, he used one of my favorite lines that I've ever seen written in a criminology paper. He suggested the relationship between sociology and personality is a lot like a ski resort full of husbands looking for women and women looking for husbands. It's not nearly as symmetrical as it might initially seem. Now, it's the five-factor model is the predominant model of personality. And this is based on this idea of a lexical hypothesis, that all of the personality traits are encoded in language. And so Costa McCrae identified all these and undertook a factor analysis and found that in addition to Eysenck's extroversion and neuroticism, there were three additional factors that could be added to this. These are agreeableness, those people who are altruistic and modest, those people who are conscientious, having higher levels of self-discipline and competence, and the openness is a third factor associated with this five-factor model. So this five-factor model has been compared to offending. And as an example, I've chosen a longitudinal study in Finland, which compared the personality profiles using the five-factor model and persistence of offending using Moffat's typology of persistence. So based on both official records and self-reports, individuals were classified into being life course persistent if they had offenses before age 21 and after. They were classified as adolescent limited if they only had offenses up to age 21 and none afterwards, up to age, I think it was 56. And those people who were late onset who only had offenses after the age of 21, and those people who had no offenses. And they administered the five-factor model measured when the participants were age 42. And what they found was that there wasn't a great deal of difference between adolescent limited, late onset, and non-offenders, but between persistent offenders and non-offenders, persistent offenders were much more likely to have low agreeableness and low conscientiousness than the non-offenders. Now, you just saw Sytske present her systematic review and meta-analysis of intergenerational transmission. There has been a meta-analysis of 2 times of personality and crime. So Miller and Lynham and Jones, Miller and Lynham have conducted what they would call meta-analysis. And they're very helpful in also showing the relationship between agreeableness and conscientiousness and neuroticism. So the suggestion is that those people who are offenders are more likely to have lower agreeableness, lower conscientiousness, and higher neuroticism. But I'm just going to have a bit of a shot at both of these, simply because they're a bit like my iPhone. It looks great, it answers a lot of the questions that you want, But the back end of it, if you start fiddling around with an iPhone, you'll find that Apple will actually shut it down and you'll have an iBrick. And without the summary tables, it's very difficult to replicate these sorts of studies. And we are trying to move forward or push back the boundaries, the frontiers of knowledge, as David Farrington would say. And without the summary tables, it's very difficult to see which studies were included and which weren't. So although it's very useful for us to have this information, it doesn't really help us take it to the next level. So when we're looking at five-factor model in offending, what's missing? Well, a lot of the studies are based on administering these personality questionnaires to offenders and non-offenders. And oftentimes the offenders are actually in prison. Now, I've been doing a fair amount of work in prison, and I can tell you that prison may affect your personality, but it is certainly going to affect how you complete a personality questionnaire. We also know that if you're using official records, you're only getting the tip of the iceberg in terms of the number and types of offenses that people are taking part in. So we really need studies of self-reported offending. We also really need to start to think about whether this relationship, Ising's proposed relationship, that female offenders are the same as male offenders in terms of personality, is actually true. This is why the importance of the Pittsburgh Girls study, as we saw in yesterday's session, about why it's so important that we start to look at the causes and correlates of female offending. So definitely the pinnacle of research has been conducted by Jolliffe in 2013. A very simple study in administering questionnaires to school children. But what was particularly different about this piece of research is it actually did compare males and females separately. So we could see that we're getting that consistent finding of low agreeableness and low conscientiousness was typical of both male and female offenders. But female offenders had higher extroversion and male offenders had higher neuroticism. And when we looked at the more serious types of self-reported offenders, low agreeableness was the only characteristic that differentiated between high and low-rate male offenders, and high extroversion differentiated between female high and low-rate offenders, so some difference there between males and female offenders. So the research question for this paper is then, what's the relationship between personality as measured by the five-factor model and self-reported offending in male and female adults? This, to my knowledge, is one of the first studies that's compared self-reported offending in the five-factor model with adults. And then, of course, it's to what extent these differences may hold up for a range of other family, parental, and social risk factors that we might have. So you've been introduced to the Cambridge study. If you aren't aware of the Cambridge study, you've clearly come in late to the session, so I'm not going to reward you for coming in late. It is, however, a fantastic study of 411 males from the ages who've been followed up from the ages of 8 to 48 in a social interview, further in official records. But obviously, there are no females here. What we do have, however, is the children of the Cambridge study. And the children of the Cambridge study were interviewed between the ages of 2004 and 2013, and they were administered the five-factor model. So of the 691 G3 children known, we have information from 551 who were actually interviewed. So that's 84.4%, which is very impressive. More than 85% of those individuals who were in UK and Ireland were interviewed, and even more than close to 60% of those who were abroad were interviewed as well. So this forms the sample of the current study. They were administered the five-factor model. It has items, it asks you things like, I see myself as someone who is. And I've actually selected the items that most typify my personality. So I see myself as someone who's outgoing and sociable. I see myself who is generally trusting. Now, that would be negatively scored for agreeableness. Conscientiousness is I see myself who is someone who is easily distracted. You would negatively score that. And neuroticism, I see myself as someone who is relaxed and handles stress well, and openness, you can see. So these are the 44 item scales that were administered to the 591 children of the original Cambridge study. Also, as part of the children's study, we asked them about self-reported offending. We had a total of 13 items which they were asked to endorse. You can see that, as we know from self-reported offending, it's normative. We all know what you guys get up to. Almost 90% of the males reported at least one of these offenses, and 2/3 of the females reported at least one offense. So it was a difference of 3.6%, an odds ratio of 3.6 difference. We know males and females are different. In order to study this, we dichotomized both the males and females separately into the worst 25%, the most criminal, and the rest. And it's important to note something that we don't have to do in the Cambridge study very often. We had to be mindful of age age differences, but there was no significant difference in age between related to self-reported offending, and no relation either between age and personality. Now, just to support treating males and females separately, you can see here that there are differences in personality in every facet of the personality between males and females. There is females were more extroverted than males, which is a bit surprising. Not surprising for females, males were much less agreeable and much less conscientious. Not surprising for males, females were more neurotic. But somewhat surprisingly, in this study, males were scored higher in openness than females as well. So we have males being much higher on delinquency than females. We have massive personality differences. So obviously, it's important that we consider these two males and females quite separately. So what we did is, instead of treating it as a linear scale, we dichotomized the personality facets into their risk categories as well. So those people that scored the highest on extroversion, the highest 25% versus the rest. And so we're doing a comparison here of these are the proportion of people who have scored high in self-reported offenses for high extroversion, for example. So you can see that there was no difference between those people scoring high in self-reports and low on extroversion, but there was for agreeableness and there was for neuroticism, but no other differences for males. Now, for females, there was no difference with extroversion, no difference with agreeableness, although there was some difference with conscientiousness, just about statistically significant for neuroticism, but not quite, and no difference with openness. Now, because this is a part of the Cambridge study, you know that there's going to be other risk factors there. And so we were actually able to have risk factors from the social interview with the children as well. So they were asked about their experience of physical punishment, their experience of poor supervision, whether they had been separated from their father, left school early, or had no A level. So that's at the top level before you go to the university in England and Wales. But we were also able to use risk factors from the actual G2, the original Cambridge study. And so we had information there about whether they had been convicted, which is obviously very important, whether the parents had been authoritarian, young parents, and so forth. So we looked at the relationship between the self-reported offending scale that we created and these risk factors. I've only included the significant risk factors here in support of what Sytske was saying, is that those people who, parents who were convicted, their children were much more likely to be in the higher end of self-reported offending. Physical punishment, poor supervision. If it says G3, it's from the kids' study, so it's their reporting. And if it says 32, it comes from the parents' study, so it's been connected in that way. So you can see this set of risk factors were also related to self-reported offending for males. For females, you can see that, again, convicted parents were quite important, but there was more family factors that were related, particularly parental conflict being a new one that came in here. So, and being separated from a child both at 32 and separated from a child based on their own self-reports were all predictive of self-reported offending. So what we did is we then did a logistic regression to look at these separately for males and females. And when we put the significant variables in, this is what we found, that low agreeableness did independently predict self-reported offending, as did self-reports of being physically punished by your parents and poor parental supervision for males. For females, however, we didn't find that personality, their significant personality features, predicted self-reported offending. It was only their reports of poor parental supervision and the parents' reports of poor conflict up to age 32 that were related. So this isn't a particularly surprising finding for those of us who have worked in the area of male and female offending. Low agreeableness did appear to be an important aspect of understanding adult male self-reported offending, but this isn't the case with females. This goes back to work that David and Kate Painter did years ago, which showed that male offending is tends to be much more influenced by individual factors, whereas female offending tends to be more influenced by social and family factors. And obviously this has limitations for research because obviously in terms of interventions to prevent or reduce offending, with males it can be relatively simple in terms of addressing aspects of self-control, this aspect of low agreeableness. With females, we might require different types of interventions perhaps. We know that Rolf Lober has been working on the Pittsburgh girls study, but I'd like to propose that he does a prospective longitudinal experimental study with females as well, where we embed an experiment within the longitudinal study. Rolf should get started soon. I'm aware of the limitations here that we did treat all of this as risk factors, and we may want to trichotomize these and look at them as promotive factors as well. Other limitations with this research is it is just a cross-sectional study. It is a cross-sectional study, but it is a cross-sectional study that's on steroids in a way because we have the G2 information there as well. The last limitation we have is that it is self-reported offending. We know it to be valid to some extent, but it's important to try and validate this by comparing it with official records, which is something I was hoping to be able to do in time for this paper, but I didn't. And so that's all.
Well, everyone is keeping beautifully to time so far, so we're doing very well. Yeah, our fourth presenter is Tara McGee from Griffith University in Australia. And again, Tara has changed the title, so I won't read out the title in the program, but it will be revealed to all of us shortly. Okay, there it is. The Integrated Cognitive Antisocial Potential Theory, New Empirical Tests.
This paper presentation is based on a chapter that David and I have prepared. Whoa. I've done something to the computer already. Impressive. So the focus is testing antisocial attitude in terms of long-term antisocial potential in the ICAP theory. So the ICAP theory is the Integrated Cognitive Antisocial Potential Theory. It was developed by David Farrington, and its key construct is antisocial potential. There's two main mechanisms within this theory. That's long-term antisocial potential and short-term antisocial potential. Long-term antisocial potential refers to between individual variation, and it looks at things like impulsiveness and draws on strain modelling and socialisation processes as well as life events. The relative ordering of antisocial potential tends to be consistent over time, but we know that absolute levels change with age, peaking in the teenage years, and because of changes within individuals that affect long-term antisocial potential. Short-term antisocial potential, on the other hand, focuses on within individual variation and focuses on motivating and situational factors. This is David's model. Let's step through it. So today we're just focusing on the long-term antisocial potential. And one of the key factors is long-term energising and directing capabilities. And low-income unemployment and school failure are examples of these. And this draws on strain theory, where desires for material goods and status among intimates and excitement may motivate antisocial behaviour. Another element is attachment and socialisation, and we see that attachment and socialisation are affected by poor child rearing, disrupted families, and low anxiety. So we can see in the existing literature that cold and rejecting parenting and family disruption affect those processes of attachment and socialisation. We also have the impact of antisocial models on long-term antisocial behaviour, and antisocial models refer to things like criminal parents, delinquent peers, delinquent schools, and high crime neighbourhoods. And we know that these can all have an impact on long-term antisocial potential. Other factors that are important for long-term antisocial potential are impulsiveness and life events. So like I said, the focus today is on long-term antisocial potential. We're not testing short-term antisocial potential in this particular paper. So to date, there's only been one independent test of the ICAP theory, and that was conducted by Vanderlaan, Blom, and Clemens. And and I can't pronounce Dutch surnames, and their examination of long-term individual, family and school factors was they found that it does correlate with serious delinquency, so it supported the theory in that regard. And they also found that the probability of delinquency increased with the number of risk factors experienced. They also tested the short-term antisocial potential element of the theory, and they found support for that as well. The previous research that scaffolds the research that we're presenting today, Farrington and his colleagues looked at risk factors for convictions in the Generation 2 males and also their sons of the Cambridge study in delinquent development. And Farrington, Tophy and Crago looked at the intergenerational transmission of convictions from G2 males to G3 males. And then also scaffolding this research is a chapter that David and I did looking at absolute change and in antisocial attitude over time, but what we also found is that although antisocial attitude goes down over time, there is relative stability in that characteristic. So the focus of today's research is on the relationship between antisocial attitude and long-term antisocial potential and convictions. The examination of risk factors and antisocial attitude and convictions, and what we're going to look at is whether or not the risk factors are verified in the G2 males and replicated in the G3 males. I feel like this is a little redundant. You've had a good summary of the Cambridge study in delinquent development already this afternoon. It's a data set that you're now all familiar with for listening to the presentations before me. I'm also using the G3 data in this presentation, and Darrick has summarised that well for you. Well, that's interesting. We'll skip that blank model. Oh no, here we go, it's building. Thank you. So this is a good overview of the 3 generations of data that we're looking at. So in generation 1, it's the parents who were interviewed once a year when the boy in the Cambridge study in delinquent development was aged 8 to 15. Generation 2 is the data that's commonly referred to when people are examining the Cambridge study in delinquent development. It's the 411 boys who were interviewed 9 times up to age 48. And then we have the Generation 3 data, which is 551 people interviewed, 291 males and 260 females. Today we're only looking at the males though. So the G2 risk factors that we're looking at are across 4 domains: socioeconomic, parental, family and individual. Socioeconomic factors include low family income, large family size, poor housing and low socioeconomic status. The parental factors that we're looking at include convictions of G1 parents, young mothers and young fathers, which is having a child when you're at a relatively young age. Family factors that we're looking at are poor supervision, harsh and erratic discipline, parental conflict and disruptive families. And the individual factors are low junior school attainment, high daring, high hyperactivity and high troublesomeness. We attempted to create the same risk factors within the G3, although they're not exactly replicated, but they're similar across the 4 domains. So we have socioeconomic, parental, family, and individual once again. But the risk factors we're looking at in the G3 are low take-home pay, large family size, poor housing, and low socioeconomic status. In the parental domain, convictions of the G2 father and G2 mother, and also young fathers and young mothers once again. And then in the family domain, poor parental supervision, physical punishment, parental conflict, and disrupted family. And in the individual domain, early school leaving, high risk-taking, poor attention, and suspensions and expulsions from school. The antisocial attitude measure that we're using comes from 2 subscales, and it was measured at ages 18, 32, and 48 in the Cambridge study in delinquent development. This is an attitudinal measure. It includes attitudes that are categorised as anti-establishment and aggressive attitudes. It should be made clear that it's not aggressive behaviour, but it's aggressive attitudes. And these were combine to make our antisocial attitude scale. So the questions that we wanted to answer in this particular piece of work is whether or not antisocial attitude is related to convictions up to age 20, and do the risk factors across socioeconomic, parental, family and individual domains predict antisocial attitude. So looking at the data, you can see that with an increasing antisocial attitude score, there's much higher rates of convictions, so that those who have 8 or more convictions, those who have a score of 8 or more on the antisocial attitudes scale have, there's 51% of them who've had a conviction. Because of this, the characteristics of this particular measure aren't linear. It was dichotomized into 0 to 7 and 8+. And you can see that there's significant differences with the odds ratio and the area under the curve, showing that you're much more likely to have convictions with a higher antisocial attitude score. This finding was replicated in the G3 data. The quartile split for this particular data, though, was at 7 or more. And you can see that those who had a score of 7 or more on the antisocial attitude scale had, the 31% of those were convicted. And again, that's significant differences between the two groups on antisocial attitude. When we look at the risk factors for antisocial attitude and convictions, we can see that the strongest effects for antisocial attitude, the risk factors that predict high antisocial attitude, were low family income, large family size, poor supervision, low junior attainment, and high troublesomeness. Now, these were similar for convictions. The same risk factors predicted convictions, with a couple of exceptions. Parental conflict and disrupted family additionally predicted the number of convictions. So the ones that were high in antisocial attitude also predicted convictions, but parental conflict and disrupted family were in addition to those. Overall, we saw that 11 of the risk factors examined were significantly related to antisocial attitude, and 13 of the risk factors were related to convictions. When we look at the same 4 domains of socioeconomic, parental, family, and individual factors in the Generation 3 data, we see similar patterns. The risk factors which were most strongly related to the antisocial attitude scores were poor housing and low SES in the socioeconomic domain. Within the parental domain, the convictions of the father and the mother, it's just the mother was the strongest one, although it was significant for the father as well. In the family domain, poor supervision, which was reported by the G3 person retrospectively, and also early school leaving and suspensions and expulsions from school were also very high. When we look at convictions, we see similar risk factors related to the outcome of convictions, but in addition, we see the impact of a low take-home pay when the G2 parent was aged 32, and retrospective reports of physical punishment by the G3 person, male. So overall, 7 of the risk factors that we looked at were significantly related to the antisocial attitude score, and 11 of the risk factors for convictions. So in summary, is antisocial attitude related to convictions up to age 20? Yes, high antisocial attitude scores were found to predict a higher rate of convictions. And do risk factors across socioeconomic, parental, familial, and individual domains predict antisocial attitude? Yes, they do. However, a high number of risk factors were found to be associated with the G2 males compared to the G3 males. We do have some limitations in this study. Some of those have been already canvassed in previous presentations. Some of the measures in the G3 are retrospective rather than prospective. Most of the research that's been done in the Cambridge study on delinquent development is using prospective longitudinal data, but for this particular analysis, we needed to use some retrospective reports. And also that some of the measures across the two generations are not directly comparable. And an example of this is that we had a measure of hyperactivity in generation 2, and we matched that up with attention problems in generation 3. In terms of future directions for this research and research in this area more broadly, we do need to do more empirical tests of ICAP theory and all the developmental life course criminology theories more generally, with multiple data sets, looking at the key postulates in each of the theories and testing them across multiple time periods and also geographical locations with data. The ICAP could have more refinement based on the relative importance of different risk factors at different ages, and that would be one way to move this particular theory forward. Additional risk factors that we didn't have available to us for this study also need to be investigated in the context of the ICAP theory, and these include things in biological and domains and also empathy. We also need different models to explain, we need to see if we need different models rather to explain things like prevalence versus frequency of offending, persistence versus desistance, and also the length of criminal careers, and whether or not the same constellation of risk factors come together to predict all these different domains of criminal careers. And also what's needed more in terms of testing this theory is testing of short-term situational influences. This work will be published soon in a forthcoming chapter in the Oxford Handbook on Developmental and Life Course Criminology. I'm sure you'll all want to go out and buy it and read it. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Tara. I will ask all the 4 presenters to come up on the platform, and we'll invite questions from the audience. And when you give your question, perhaps you could say who you are and also who you're addressing the question to primarily, if it's one person rather than everybody. Any questions? Friedrich Lozell.
I have 2 questions and to 2 different people. The first one, very briefly, or at first a very positive comment, very interesting data, I think, on the ICAP. It is under-investigated, I think. Darrick, your study reminded me to my dissertation more than 40 years ago, where I also addressed Ising theory already. And I found, and we found it repeatedly afterwards in other studies, that extraversion is a too broad concept, that it's mainly the impulsivity subfactors that relates. Hans Ising, I met him in Germany at this time, he was not so happy. He still went on with extraversion, but because from his theoretical biological concept. And the other factors, the sociability or so, is not so strongly related. Did you separate these 2 aspects?
We didn't so much in the BFI with the 44 items. It's very much about the sociability, venturesomeness. It's much less about the impulsivity, which is probably why it doesn't
exactly.
predict offending very well. It's more extroversion will be the people having fun at the party tonight. They're not going to be necessarily
and this is not a good item
there as well.
They can be impulsive at the party as well, though.
And my question to Tara, what would you say your antisocial attitude scale you constructed? I've seen some items. It looks similar to PO's morality scale, but he thinks it's the only 1 or 2 aspects that are relevant. Yours is much broader. You have a number of, and I kept a number of factors. So what do you think? Is there similarity between antisocial attitudes and morality, and how much? And
I think there probably are some parallels there between the idea of morality and antisocial attitude. I think we possibly think about it in a more psychological sense, in terms of attitudes being related to behaviour. I do see the parallels that you see.
Okay,
I mean, the aim was to have an operational definition of antisocial potential and empirical measurement. That was the aim of the antisocial attitude scale. Rolf Lober, you have a...
Okay. Very interesting panel, very provocative, and Darrick, I'm not going to do the intervention study that you're suggesting, but I think if you come to Pittsburgh, we can have you do it. But Darrick, I think the issue of personality and crime is one that has been visited many times, and I think your results are very illuminating and helpful. But what advice do you give to people saying, well, perhaps personality items really should become more clearly incorporated in screening devices for identifying individuals at future risk?
So prospective prediction in intake to treatment programs, are you suggesting?
Yes, for example.
I'd like it from a research point of view, because that's one of the things that we've found in other work that David and I have done, is there's very few studies where we administer any sort of psychological measure at time 1, do something with someone, administer a psychological measure at time 2, and then look at change in offending. So it'd be very interesting to look at how change in personality features might relate to change in offending later. So I'd like it from a research point of view, but always there's, from an ethical point of view, there's always a risk that someone gets labeled when prospective probabilities at predicting things in the future are not very good.
But so are you advising not to use it as a screening device? Or
if we're talking about from a research point of view, I think it's fantastic. If we're talking about using it for any sort of clinical work,
yes,
then I'd be a bit more nervous.
Okay.
Can I say, I think the problem with the existing measures is that they're rather static as opposed to dynamic, most of the risk assessment instruments. So what we really need are dynamic instruments where we can measure change over time during the treatment, for example, and relate that to changes in antisocial behavior. I think that would be desirable. I think virtually nobody has studied changes in risk assessment instruments versus changes in antisocial behavior. There are some studies of changes in risk assessment instruments versus levels of antisocial behavior, but not versus change.
And I think this is particularly important if we assume changes in personality.
Yes.
Let me turn to Sytske. Sytske's meta-analysis I told you already, I think is really wonderful. But you've found a few findings about fathers and daughters and mothers and daughters. And so the question really is, what is behind that? Why would that take place?
Yeah, so what we found is that the transmission is stronger from mothers to kids than from fathers to kids. And then you're asking what are explanations for this?
And particularly the transmission to daughters. Yes.
Yeah, particularly to daughters. Well, I mentioned a couple of explanations, so we can apply that to girls as well. One of the things I said is generally mothers are still the main caregivers of kids, and especially in the older samples that we've included. So they might be a stronger role model. So they might see their mother's behavior more often. So, and the other thing is, if the mother then falls away because maybe she's incarcerated, then that's has a bigger impact on those kids. And what you see as well is with incarceration, if fathers are incarcerated, mothers are most often still the main caregiver. If mothers are incarcerated, the kids don't necessarily go to the father, they go to foster parents, grandparents. So it's more disruptive if mothers are punished and sentenced and incarcerated. And the other thing is the gender paradox that you discuss regularly as well, where maybe these mothers are more serious because it's more rare, that behavior. Then if it's more serious behavior, then we know that if parents are more serious criminals or they show more criminal behavior or more severe criminal behavior, transmission is stronger. So that explains why we would see a stronger relationship from mothers to daughters. I know that David has said before that maybe transmission is stronger in same gender relationships, but that's not necessarily what we have found overall. Yeah, those are a couple.
So, but anyway, one of the hypotheses that you have is that the mother would be more affected.
Yeah.
But I think it's worthwhile to test various models and to figure out why the gender paradox would apply. So something for the future. Thanks.
It's a version of the dose-response relationship, isn't it? That the idea is that the intervention of a criminal mother is a bigger intervention, a bigger dose than a criminal father. Because there's fewer of them, they're more extreme.
Yes, right. That's what the paradox would imply. Yes. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions from anyone? Okay, well, if there's no more questions, thank you very much for coming, and we congratulate the presenters.